Yuval, welcome back to the channel. My name is David. Today we're going to be talking about my 5 essential camera settings for concert photography. As many of you know, I shoot a lot of live music and concerts, and I've only been doing this for about a year now. So I wanted to make a tutorial video to kind of share the settings that I've learned to use over the last year while shooting live music. Now, this list isn't going to be a hard list where like you have to live and die by this list. You know, the settings and everything are very venue dependent and band dependent. Sometimes you have a venue that's really dark, so you're probably gonna have to shoot wide open or with like a high ISO. And sometimes you could shoot with a slower shutter speed because the band's very stationary. You're gonna wanna adjust these depending on the situation, which is also why I always stress to get there early so you have an idea of what you're working with. So that said, let's just jump into today's video and get started with these 5 tips. Shooting in manual is my preferred mode while photographing or recording video during a show. This will give you complete control over the exposure of your images or video. Typically when you're capturing a show, the stage lighting will be pretty consistent, so once you get your settings dialed in, you won't have to make too many adjustments as the show goes on. Now, if there is any type of changes to the lighting, it's often to the background lights that change depending on the kind of music being played, or for effect. The best part about using mirrorless cameras nowadays is that they will show you the live exposure preview, allowing you to get an idea of what the final exposure will be. This one's really a no-brainer. Always shoot in RAW, because like shooting in manual mode, this gives you complete control in post to edit your images to your liking. So let's say hypothetically that the white balance or exposure or something's just a little off with your photo straight out of camera. With a RAW file, you can always adjust it with better flexibility than if it was a JPEG image. Now, let's say you're shooting for a client who needs the images ASAP, then you can shoot RAW plus JPEG because you can quickly deliver the usable JPEGs and then edit the RAWs at a later point in time. So this tip is very venue dependent because sometimes you're shooting indoors, sometimes you're shooting outside, so adjust your aperture accordingly. For example, if I'm shooting in a bright sunny day, let's say during the summer outside, then I will usually set my aperture to around f8 and just leave it there. I find that f8 produces very sharp images and is often the sweet spot of the lens. Now, if you're shooting indoors where the lighting isn't as harsh, or let's say it's dimly lit, then I would shoot wide open at f2.8 or faster. Shooting wide open also allows your subjects to pop from the background thanks to that shallow depth of field. When I'm shooting live music, my go-to shutter speed range is 1/160 to 1/250 if I am shooting in an indoor venue where there's a good amount of stage lighting. I feel that this range is fast enough to freeze the action. Most of the artists I photograph are pretty stationary on stage, so I don't need to shoot with an insanely fast shutter. Now, if I'm shooting outside on a bright sunny day or the show where the musicians are jumping around and so on, then I will shoot around 1/500 or faster. Keep in mind that a little bit of motion blur is okay because, again, you're photographing live music, you do want to convey some of the action that is happening on stage, and a little bit of motion blur goes a long way. Now, for video, I will always shoot double my frame rate. So for example, if I'm shooting 24 frames a second, then my shutter speed will be set to 1/150, or if I'm shooting 60 frames a second, then 1/120. The reason you want to set your shutter value to double your frame rate is that it will give you natural looking motion blur. If you were to crank your shutter, the action might look a little too jarring with no motion blur. The dreaded 3-letter word that makes inexperienced photographers quiver because of the dreaded noise that shows up in your images. I often shoot in low light environments where sometimes I have to shoot at 6400 or higher. Of course, if you're using a fast aperture lens, that will help, but sometimes even a f1.2 aperture is not enough. Will higher ISO introduce grain to the image? Yes, but modern day cameras have gotten so good with high ISO performance, and software can now easily clean them up as well. Also remember this, it's easier to clean up a grainy, properly exposed image that's in focus over a blurry, underexposed image. Now, depending on the venue's lighting, I usually set my ISO to 800 and then work my way up or down. Don't be afraid to embrace the grain because sometimes this grain adds a little bit of character to your images, especially if you like to convert them into black and white. There's just something about black and white music photos that just like, mwah, chef's kiss, so good. Let's get the video segment out of the way first. I always set my camera's video autofocus to continuous with subject tracking, or if it's a crowded stage, to zone or center point autofocus. For photos, I always set it to continuous autofocus with subject tracking. Using subject tracking will give me and the talent on stage the freedom of moving around and still let me get my shot from anywhere in the frame. Now for the drive mode, since I usually shoot subjects that don't move around that much on stage, I use the single frame release, meaning I only take one picture when I press the button. For the kind of shows that I shoot, I feel like I don't need anything more than the single frame release. However, if I do end up shooting like a rock band or a band that's just moving around, jumping around and so on, I'll shoot with a high continuous burst rate. Like I've said in the other sections, all of these settings are very venue dependent and band dependent, so don't be afraid to adjust when you have to. And that's the video. Thank you guys so much for watching today's video. I hope you found it helpful. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, double tap the dislike button twice. Trust me, it works. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. I'm gonna try to post more music photography like tutorials because I kind of want to diverse my content a little bit. Lately, it's been a lot of reviews and I kind of want to start doing more tutorials and maybe the occasional vlog. But that said, thanks again for watching and I'll see you in the next one. Hasta luego.